Wonderful. With that out of the way, it is my absolute pleasure to invite the Prime Minister. I thank that speaker very much for that fine speech, and I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue this debate. Am
I audible?
Yes, but your mic is a little bit low.
Just 1 second. Give me 1 moment. Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
All right. Just give me seconds to set up my timer. Also, Bilal, if you can post like timestamps in the chat, that would be great. Because I'm on my phone. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. To introduce a bit of clarity in this debate, I want to frame that they have mischaracterized our alternative very, very, very much, right? We said two things at first. We said, number one, the branding of these cities and states as sanctuary states makes the existence of harms that exist within these states, the funding of institutions, the existence of social services, disproportionately worse. But secondly, our alternative literally was just to focus on making the federal system better, right? Which I'll get onto and build more on throughout my positive extension. But realize, and this is my strategic observation here at first, their main mechanism for survival across their bench is that these cities and states are rich and can continue to self-support themselves in the face of their funding being cut away, in the face of them being targeted, in the face of other states not wanting to collaborate with them because they are now branded as sanctuary states, right? What about poor blue cities and blue states? I don't think they give us any exclusive mechanisms that bypass all of these harms that are disproportionately applied to sanctuary states, that limit their funding and decrease their ability to navigate the political and economic landscape. They haven't given us any exclusive mechanism to let us believe that this will be any better than our alternative, which will be to focus on slowly making the federation better, right? But onto the idea of immigrants, right? They said, people hate migrants already, etc. So you need sanctuary states to protect them. Realize that when these sanctuary states fail, or when these states are branded as sanctuary states, immigrants are blamed more and more. Bilal literally give you a case on why social services within sanctuary states, once they fail, immigrants are blamed for exclusively harming these. And their claim to say, because this is a sanctuary state is why they are, helping you, and is why essentially your social services are failing. They're blamed more, the hate towards them increases, right? But secondly, the interesting point on how conservative states in the US are a lot more, and senators have a lot more power. Exactly. Which means that if you are a sanctuary state, you are less likely to get state cohesion. Other states are less likely to form groups and alliances with you. Other states, because they're likely to be more conservative, are less likely to have cross-funding programs with you. You're literally making our point for us. If you're a sanctuary state, you are fundamentally alienated and isolated, right? But onto the political narratives within this debate, right? Here's the reason why sanctuary states have a fundamental problem-solution gap, which will also be my positive extension, right? I think these states have a limited political capital to resist a lot of these harms that apply to them, right? The reason why they still keep picking these fights is because politicians within sanctuary cities want to gain political power within these cities. The harms that come to people within these states do not apply to these politicians. They apply to the most proximately vulnerable people within these cities. So politicians can keep saying, we're amazing, we're fighting the state for you, while people at the ground keep getting screwed over, right? These people can keep winning electoral mandates and stay shielded, while the average person on the ground keeps suffering because ICE targets their housing and they're living most directly. The federal system remains broken. ICE continues its raids, right? But on to extending the idea of shifting the burden of federal immigration dysfunction onto local institutions. Cities have to deal with the fallout of national failure. Activism, by the way, also gets screwed up because the worse your city institutions get, the more crowded your hospitals become, the more crowded your local shelters become, because sanctuary states now have to fund all of this more by themselves. The more activism shifts from, hey, the state is bad, and shifts towards the smaller narratives. Hey, our schools are so bad, our sanctuary state isn't doing enough for us, our local mayor promised us XYZ, isn't delivering XYZ. The reason why this is true is twofold, because people are fundamentally short-termist politically. They care about immediate concerns. If the sanctuary state cannot fund them and cannot give them meaningful life because their funding is dried up or taken away from them, their proximate concerns outweigh this. The impacts of this are very simple. Local backlash increases more and more. Violence increases. The city cannot feasibly protect them. Right-wing media capitulates on that and says, look what your city, sanctuary city did, and look what your immigrants got you. The impacts of this are very, very existent in the status quo. In NYC 2023, the mayor rolled back migrant shelter protections floods because he ran out of funding. In Denver and Chicago, city officials demanded federal funding or began rejecting immigrants from buses. So cities are swinging politically to the right and are rejecting sanctuary state policies to escape these additional responsibilities. This looks like NYC in the 1990s in Giuliani, right? What is our alternative and why are we taking this debate? Because city services are less burdened in our state. You can still get like targeted funding. You can build solidarity coalitions with other states. No one wants to cooperate with sanctuary states. You can lobby and sue the federation. You're not locked out because of bad, harmful state meta-narrative. Boring policy for the federation that increases the policy mandate of the federation instead of symbolic drama. You increase federal funding slowly for things like immigrant courts, etc. We have real tangible action because in government world, the sanctuary label politicizes and attacks these programs and makes it a lot worse, right? So the impacts in their side are people still have no pathways to immigration. Police in these cities are ran through and dried up because they don't get ICE funding. ICE and by the way, the Constitution have the exclusive ability to do things like implement or preempt statewide laws, right? Federation and the US Constitution can fundamentally do this because of supremacy clauses in the US Constitution, where sanctuary state laws can be preempted by federal laws. Immigrants can be branded as a national security issue and funding can be taken away from them more. And this narrative can be very easily justified because, by the way, sanctuary states don't have the media control to justify their actions and visibly justify their actions to the vast majority of even their own people. Because at the end of the day, the vast federal narrative will fundamentally convince people within these states slowly that the sanctuary state isn't doing enough for you. You should just be conservative. You should just vote conservative. Why do we win this debate? And what is the main weighing we are going for? We're not saying the federal system will become better tomorrow, but we're saying that this policy exclusively makes it worse. This policy, like Bilal said, gives people a false narrative and a harmful narrative of belief where people believe that the city will protect them and therefore they are disproportionately detached from the intellectual existence of their politics because people are not aware of fundamentally how much they can sort of get out of this. People aren't aware of the what is my time, by the way? Sorry, I don't have a timer on. Okay, 6 minutes. I still have time. Anyways, the impact of this very fundamentally is that because people are detached from the ground politically and the state cannot justify institutions for them, people fundamentally start turning away from sanctuary cities as well. When people start turning away from them, the endpoints that government is trying to protect you from, oh, states turning conservative, are bound to happen because of the greater level of mass media propaganda that the state then pushes on you when these sanctuary states fail. Our model is fundamentally slower but also long-termist. Our model protects more people because we vouch for the most important forms of legislation that can apply proportionately across the United States of America. We say, even if it is slow, it gives you a mandate, it improves the ability of people to trust the state, and it doesn't create divisions where a state funding dries up, and it doesn't lead you to few blue states that can fund themselves while the rest blue states, when they turn sanctuary, dry up and lose out on any sort of political mandate. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for that fine speech, and everybody for a great help out. I now invite the Member of Government to continue this debate. Hear, hear.
Visible.
You are.
All right. The gap in OG is rightfully called out by opening opposition. How exactly will sanctuary states survive when the federal government retaliates with lawsuits and cutting federal funding? I think the closing government extension and positioning is very simple. Setting up sanctuary states promotes leverage for cooperation and long-term cooperation between the federal government and states. And long-term cooperation is far more important than opening government's protections for immigrants, which is far seen as something that's likely going to be temporary and likely going to be tempered very heavily by federal government retaliation. Secondly, we're going to talk about why sanctuary states raise the salience of immigration issues and why that is generally a good thing. First point on cooperation. I want to note here that the federal government is always likely to have an anti-immigrant slump beyond the Trump administration. I want to note here that opening government's arguments on politicization. That is to say, Trump and the Republicans are too strong. There's a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court. Therefore, they'll block legal paths to immigration. We are just unsure and uncertain as to why this is a trend that will happen into the long run. Why will the Supreme Court always be 6-3? Why will Trump's faction always be in power after 2026? We posit to you that the federal government will structurally have an anti-immigration stand beyond politicization reasons. 3 mechanisms over here. Firstly, the federal government always has a greater onus on dealing with national security issues because the first actor to be scapegoated whenever such issues are prominent or whenever such issues become showcased on the national news level is the federal government, because they have the most agencies, they have the most resources to be able to stop these threats. They are seen as the actor of the most responsibility. Secondly, the American voter of any political affiliation will always care about immigration, particularly those in the center of the political spectrum, and there is a need to cover this base. And the reason is just because immigrants are always going to be an easy pick for any politician to scapegoat. Think about how the Democrats in Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have themselves also issued anti-immigrant rhetoric at some points during their presidency and vice presidency. Thirdly, there is a large rural or conservative slant that is structurally embedded in the electoral college. That is to say, there's always going to be an average anti-immigrant or Rust Belt voter within the Sun Belt, within the Rust Belt, etc., that will always be salient within the political space and always be a base that the politicians have to cater to. So therefore, they always have to necessarily outflank or at the very least push to the political center when it concerns immigration issues. I want to note 2 observations from this. The first is that the short-term protections that opening government talks about don't resolve the fundamental clash between state incentives, which is to protect immigrants and safekeep their economic value, and the federal incentives, which is for national security and voter placation. These protections will always be insufficient in the long run. The second observation here is that the legal immigration roads that opening option posits will not expand by much, or even if they do expand, they will not address issues in illegal immigration, which are the main actors being affected and which are the issues that will probably be surfaced more in the political space, i.e. to say that the comparative that opening opposition talks about is really not that relevant in this debate. Why will sanctuary states be an effective tool for long-term cooperation between state and government? The first thing to note here is that short-term skirmishes always cause bad press and unnecessary political risk for the federal government. That is to say, when the clash between the National Guard and the Californian security agencies and local forces happened, this was objectively bad press for Trump. It put off the median voter who leans towards peace and stability. And there's actually a very important underlying observation here, which is that Trump's approval rating, or basically approval rating of any administration, is highest on immigration is highest when it happens covertly, when it happens in a manner that is not particularly salient or especially chaotic to the public sphere, because this is something that destabilizes his popularity. This is something that erodes his facade of strength. But secondly, I think bad press can also highlight the incompetency or the inadequacy of the federal government, i.e. when a sanctuary state is able to hold out government pressure for a long period of time, or at the very least issue strong narratives or strong rhetoric against this. For example, when Gavin Newsom is able to rally around the flag resisting dictators and a tyrannical government, this is something that is likely to hold significant amount of political risk for any federal government. This is something that's also likely to invite huge amounts of international criticism from NGOs, from international organizations, from other countries in the free world, etc. But thirdly, I just want to note that any kind of standoff between the federal government and the state is always going to be costly and expensive. It costs money to withhold federal funding. It costs money to issue to send national guards into particular states, for example. These are things that federal governments would tend not to do if given the choice to do so. Therefore, the government is more likely to default to cooperation. I want to posit 2 reasons for this. First, striking a deal on immigration is less politically risky and better able to seal concrete outcomes or concrete wins for both the federal government and the state, i.e. the state is likely going to be able to seal certain protections for illegal immigrants, is likely going to be able to seal certain protections in terms of requiring vetting or requiring levels of approval before you can actually issue these kinds of arrests, but it also probably allows the federal government to claim some kind of victory in terms of being able to issue more national security regulations, etc. And so the second reason for this, therefore, it allows the government and states to be able to claim a win in the political space. Before I move on to how such cooperative deals are likely to be functionally better in the long run, I want to hear from opening opposition.
Okay, federal government is going to be hostile because federal government likes standoffs. At the very same time, federal government is less likely to be hostile because it's more expensive to do so. Pick one.
there is no contradiction here. I literally don't get how that's a contradiction. How are such cooperative deals likely to be functionally better in the long run? I want to note here that the federal government is likely to give concessions on basic protections for illegal immigrants. That is to say, there are probably going to be fewer detention centers. There's probably going to be requiring approval of state and local councillors before arrests are made. There's probably going to be increased levels of political asylum visa issuance, for example. These are functional long-term improvements that will meaningfully and tangibly improve the lives of immigrants into the long run, far beyond what opening government posits. But I think this is something that therefore weighs over opening government in terms of impacts into the long run and in terms of certainty. The second argument I'm going to bring to you is why raising the salience of immigration is good. I want to note here that any kind of standoff between the federal government and the state, i.e., when ICE goes in to basically arrest these illegal immigrants, these are things that are going to be high profile. These are things that are going to heavily increase the salience of immigration enforcement. I want to note there are two observations here. One, there's going to be an increased amount of flashing or highlighting of these abuses on the national stage. But secondly, I think these leads to two extremely important outcomes. The first is that you are able to gain sympathy and shift the political needle on the national level, because the reason why these issues are not able to shift the political spectrum in the status quo is because they are hidden underneath the carpet. These are things that are not shown, and these are things that are not able to reach out to the median voter who will end up voting for pro-immigration, anti-immigration policies. But secondly, I think this probably also allows immigrants the information they need to be able to escape or move to a different part of the city or state, because they now know when ICE will pull up. They now know that the government is basically issuing the federal guard to come into this state. So these are things that functionally improve the lives of immigrants as a whole. For all of those reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very much for that fine speech, and I now call upon the member of opposition to continue this debate. Here.
Am I audible?
You are.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sanctuary cities provoke aggressive ICE enforcement, and this causes widespread harm, undermines immigrant safety, and also stalls meaningful immigration reform. 3 pushes to the case we just heard from CG on how it leads to more like salience about immigrants' rights. Firstly, I think sanctuary cities actually mainly provoke backlash rather than constructive debate. There's a lack of like there's a lack of like nuanced discussions being fostered, and I also think that sanctuary policies trigger strong federal opposition and have the effect of like polarizing public opinion and hardening stances on both sides. Secondly, I also think that oftentimes the media coverage that surrounds these things focuses on the conflict and the drama surrounding the enforcement and not necessarily on policy solutions. I think the narrative that surrounds sanctuary cities oftentimes becomes about raids and clashes and the violence itself, not necessarily about like the systemic immigration reforms that sanctuary cities like supposedly support. And thirdly, I also think that just controversy like entrenches the idea of it being like highly polarizing, and it just leads to a level of political gridlock where politicians are just less willing to address immigrant issues safely. Okay. Our main push on why sanctuary cities are unique in provoking and escalating ICE raids. Firstly, I think the comparative here is that you have non-sanctuary cities and where there's like low friction ICE enforcement. Like ICE relies heavily on institutional handovers where you have like local police giving them information, local jails flagging undocumented immigrants, and also that local courts would hand over like arrest data and stuff to ICE. I think these mechanisms are specifically allow ICE to track and identify and arrest immigrants both cheaply and also quietly, and that there's not like a lot of fuss and hullabaloo made about it. Oftentimes it occurs behind closed doors, and there is a level of like oversight and bureaucracy to it. It just also requires very little like manpower or like foot soldiers being deployed, etc. I think to the extent that you introduce sanctuary policies in this way, you have a level of the cooperation breakdown between local government and federal, and that sanctuary cities terminate this like information pipeline, and that police departments now don't respond to ICE detainers. They also don't, like jails don't notify ICE of release times, and also just like cities like city agencies don't like share information about like their undocumented residents, etc. I think this creates the tipping point to ICE then like becoming more like logistically involved, and that they can no longer like passively wait inside jails or just rely on the cities to provide them with data, and their like entire background enforcement model collapses to the extent that they now have to go out and actively seek the information that they can no longer access. I think to this extent is what you have is that you have some level of bureaucratic and incentive bureaucratic incentives existing already, and that ICE field officers are under like a level of internal pressure to maintain like their figures and their high deportation numbers. They do this for a few different reasons. I think they do it to like justify funding, to justify staffing levels, and also just to like make their own like agencies be seen as like legitimate. I think to the extent that like officers face a degree of like targets in arrests, especially under like Trump and the political climate, and they feel like pressure to do more. I also think that probably there exists a level of like ICE seeing like sanctuary cities as defying like federal law and government, and it also incentivizes officers to almost like make an example or make a show of these sanctuary cities. I think not only therefore do they struggle like to, or they're more incentivized to meet their quotas, but they also have like a political agenda here, in that like the Department of Justice like frames sanctuary cities as just being like pure anarchy and just running wild and being lawless. So I think to the extent that like soft enforcement is removed in sanctuary cities, what this means is that ICE has to like invent and invest in a more harder one, a harder policy of enforcement, which relies on like raids and different tactics like that. I think to the extent what this looks like basically is that ICE now shifts to more home raids, which oftentimes happen before dawn or after dusk, where local police is not in force. Secondly, I think this probably looks like public arrests, which happen near schools or bus stops or like doctors' clinics, etc., where people are generally accessible. Thirdly, I think it probably looks like there being just more surveillance and people like tracking of people's movements. And fourthly, I think it also probably looks like a lot of like collateral damage arrests, where it's like anyone who's undocumented at the scene is taken, even if it wasn't necessarily the target. I think what's important to note here is that in the comparative where you don't have sanctuary cities, this is not necessary, in that it's like when ICE do this, it's more of like a resource-driven response to the fact that like sanctuary cities obstruct the level that they can like retain data on undocumented immigrants. I think this like happens like the stage in which this happens in immigrants' lives, and why this will tie-ins are impacting into why it's like specifically harmful, is that oftentimes it happens when immigrants have started to settle into their communities, and they're trying to like integrate into like broader spheres of like work and school and like other avenues like that. I think without the cooperation with sanctuary states, what happens now is that ICE is left to guess where people are. They're also left to just blanket enforce wide areas to increase their odds of finding people. And they also rely on racial profiling or like community whistleblowers, which can lead to different like types of targeting. I think this is bad because it produces mass scale raids, and it also leads to like an intense fear that pervades throughout immigrant communities. I'll take a POI if there's one.
The problem with this is that even if it increases the incentive for ICE, Rob gives you 5 reasons why ICE lacks capacity to actually carry out these raids because of literal state laws and information asymmetry, meaning these raids aren't actually possible, or the number of
Okay, so these raids are possible. These raids are possible to the extent that they are being mandated by like ICE Department and ICE HQ. I think that they happen, and there's more of an incentive agrees to give ICE more funding and also to nationalize the National Guard to the extent that they are now not able to fulfill their capacity as much. I do think to the extent that this institution exists to inherently to deal with immigration and undocumented immigration, to the extent that it's not hard to do their job, this is where they get into the more aggressive raids. I think the impacts of this, 5 impacts here. Firstly, on community trauma and disruption. ICE raids, as I mentioned, are oftentimes sudden and home invasions, which oftentimes means that like your children or the elderly or entire families witness or experience arrest. I think that the impacts of this are, firstly, you get severe psychological trauma, also families being broken apart abruptly, and thirdly, I think you get community trust being shattered, which just leads to widespread fear. I think the alternative here is when you have cooperative enforcement, which relies on ICE working with local law enforcement. What you have is that you only have, this happens more oftentimes in jails and courts, not through surprise home raids, where you have like allowed time for families to prepare and reduce trauma. Secondly, I also think what you probably have is you have like public safety decline, and like your fear of aggressive raids now leads to immigrants avoiding reporting crimes or cooperating with the police because they feel like they might be exploited. I think what this impacts is that criminals oftentimes will now like exploit immigrants in silence, and like because they'll know that they won't speak up about it. I think in the alternative, their individuals are more trusting of the police. Thirdly, I think on economic hardship and labour market instability, and that large scale raids can often remove like a significant number of workers abruptly from key industries like agriculture and construction, which can be just like very detrimental. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker very much for that fine speech, and I now invite the government whip to continue this debate. Hehe.
Alrighty, can you guys hear me?
Yes, you are visible and audible.
Beautiful. Tyranny is never stronger than when we are not watching it. because the arrests that are encompassed by closing opposition are arrests that occur in the middle of the night through things like quiet knocks on the door by police departments in poor neighborhoods that most voters do not live in. They are arrests that no one notices, that go unseen, that are occurring in hundreds of different Republican cities that no one knows about. The only reason we know about the arrests that are taking place, the abuses that are occurring, is because those abuses are public, because they are taking place through precisely the kinds of large-scale raids that closing opposition abhors. And this debate is enormously uncharitable to American voters, because without any proof, they suggest that American voters are people without empathy, that when they see on their TV screens the kinds of terrifying images of houses being raided, of people being taken away and shipped off to El Salvador, those American voters do respond with empathy. Why Trump's approval rating on immigration goes down the most, when immigration is in the news the most, when Alberto Kilmar is sent to El Salvador, when the riots in California were happening, that is when his immigration rating is the lowest, because that is when people saw immigration deportation not as some abstract concept that maybe was good for stopping crime, but as a real thing that hurt real people. So I'll first talk about immigration protection in the short term, and then the far more important question of immigration protection in the long term. On the short term, the best argument anyone runs, and the argument that CO kind of derives, is opening opposition's claim that you cannot enforce sanctuary cities because that creates a false sense of security. So ICE will come in anyway, they'll do so in very large raids. This is sufficient to defeat open government. So open government don't actually prove that police departments can stop ICE from intervening. They are, unfortunately, it is established at the end of top half that ICE will intervene in large scale raids. But there are 4 other problems to this argument. The first problem is that the end impact of this argument is imperfectly established, because all they do is they say, well, now there's some feeling of insecurity, some feeling of uncertainty, and therefore immigrants are no longer able to survive. Therefore, their lives become terrible. But in fact, undocumented immigrants are used to uncertainty. They're used to insecurity. That is something that they've lived with for decades. It is unexplained by this team why that insecurity or uncertainty is so bad to a group of people for whom insecurity and uncertainty is the norm and has been the norm for generations. Secondly, the large-scale actions that CO and OO talk about are in fact really easy to avoid because they're huge, right? So like in the LA riots, there were live trackers of people on Twitter who would tweet where ICE was at every given time because they drive around in these enormous convoys of giant trucks. The times when immigration enforcement is hard to avoid is when immigration enforcement is happening in the middle of the night by police officers who aren't being followed around by ICE agents who are operating under the radar. So the fact that it is public is good, right? It explains why, as Bilal says, people, Uber drivers can just drive off to safe areas and wait out the immigration enforcement. It's far easier to avoid. Thirdly, and this is a critical response to closing opposition in particular, if it is very difficult to do ICE raids, right? Like ICE raids require, as they say, surveillance and like lots of resources and lots of expenditure. You could do less ICE raid, right? So if each raid involves more resources and more manning, the number of raids that occur is lower. So closing opposition explain why outside is one where less raids happen. Final problem with this off-bench argument is that our extension flips it by explaining that confrontation is valuable. We explain so for 2 reasons. Firstly, there's more attention on the fact of immigrant deportation. So it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, I'm vaguely anti-undocumented immigrants. But now there's much more attention on the fact that it's happening and the fact that it's happening very publicly and you can see it happening and you can see the violence involved. But secondly, and crucially, there's more reporting on the method of deportations. Because when there's large-scale ICE raids, you can do things like set up cameras to watch as ICE move in. You can set up cameras to watch the forms of deportations. And that is when people can see abuses. That is when transparency forces ICE not to do abuses. And I note a few things in response to the claims that are made by the other teams to this argument. First claim is made by open opposition, and they say, well, liberal voters actually get turned off when they see confrontation. And they give 2 reasons for this. The first is an empirical claim that Eric Adams in New York has stopped doing cooperation. Yeah, the reason he stopped being a sanctuary city is because Trump dropped corruption charges in exchange for him doing that. This had nothing to do with political charges. And the second thing they say is, well, liberal voters don't like riots. And there are 4 problems to this. Firstly, the blame for the riots clearly attributes to the feds, right? Like the people who instigated the riots are the federal government when they came in force. The liberal voters they're not stupid. They obviously know who caused the riot. There were not riots before the feds showed up. So the blame is attributed. Secondly, liberals are extremely supportive of due process and rights. So when you have very public abuses of power, that swings people's attention against immigration. Thirdly, the government being incompetent is being also demonstrated by people who don't like it. So even if you're kind of mid on immigration, the fact that the government is really incompetently doing immigration, it has these giant actions, I think turns you away from it. And finally, I think the reality is that factually, that is not the case. Like factually, it is the case that Trump's approval rating drops when these immigration actions happen. So you have a couple more attempts. They say, well, maybe people get polarized by these giant riots. And the first thing is, this is just an assertion, right? Like there's no proof provided as to why people would get polarized. But secondly, it's actually good if people get polarized. All the reason the problem in the US is there's consensus around immigration enforcement. So every US voter is like, yeah, we think immigration enforcement is awesome and we should kick out all the undocumented people. It's great if there's polarization, because that polarization means that at least a lot of liberal voters now turn away from immigration. The people who were lost to Trump because they thought the liberals were too weak on immigration now think immigration is a good thing. Second, the final thing that CEOs say is they say, well, maybe maybe the way you do it is bad, or maybe kind of the media portrays it as bad. But the first thing I know is the media can only talk about these riots if they explain why the riots are occurring, which is why the media has to talk about the abuses involved, because they have to explain that the abuse is occurring, that the riots are occurring because of abuse, because of intervention. But secondly, they don't explain why US people watch like Fox News. Like Fox News and like the media generally is pretty underread in the US. People actually get their information from things like TikTok and things like social media. And the vast majority of that has been enormously supportive of riots, because the most interesting TikToks are the ones of people who are down on the ground with the riots, right? It's like people like Hassan Piker pulling up to the LA riots. That's far more interesting to people than just watching Fox News rag on riots, which explains why since immigration goes up under our side, that means people are more supportive of immigrants. That in the like long and short term means immigration enforcement gets better under our side. Opening opposition. Closing opposition.
The issue with your case is that Trump is fundamentally trying to stop state rights and erode them. At the point at which he manages to do that in the next 2 years, you cannot unlock any of your long-term benefits.
So firstly, I just think there are a series of like enormously powerful factors that stop Trump, right? Like he still has to get reelected. But secondly, it's great if there's attention to him stopping states' rights, right? Like it's awesome if he's really publicly stopping states' rights by like sending in the troops, as opposed to really quietly doing it in the courts, in court cases that no one knows about, right? If he's going to be doing this either way, we'd much rather them be salient on him. But let's now talk about the future, because there's a dispute in the top half over whether states can survive the pressure from the federal government. And the answer is probably like some of the states can survive the pressure, some of the states can't. Our extension transcends this top half clash, because we explain that the pressure that occurs is likely to lead to cooperation. Trump is an anomaly, Rick explains. Trump is a very unique character who's willing to encounter enormous political risks. He does risky things like federalize the National Guard and send them in. But for the vast majority of federal administrations, that is an enormous risk. What if it goes poorly? What if there are clashes? What if your troops shoot people? What if you don't arrest enough people? What if you see incompetent? All of that risk means that you're pretty unlikely to take the kind of radical action that CEO described, which explains why into the long term, there's far more pressure to do things like consensus. And that, I would note, encompasses far more than just the next 2 years, which makes this argument substantially more important than anything else anyone else wants to run in this debate. Very happy to go.
I thank that speaker very much for that fine speech, and I now invite the opposition whip to finish off this debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
And I'm just my clock up. Lovely. POIs in chat, please. But if I don't take a POI by like 5:45, just shout it out because I will forget. 2 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A couple of responses. Firstly, to get what we get out of OG, unique responses that we don't get. Secondly, I'm going to deal with what we get out of closing government, then some bench weighing. Particularly on the economic point, a new piece of analysis on the economic point is that Trump and the federal government has a capacity to show how the products and the services within these states are able to be exported, i.e. the federal government has the power to put tariffs on the govs and like limit the amount of like exporting and importing that these states can do, which cripples their ability to bring in money into their own states, which is another way. Secondly, Republican states, at the point at which like Republican states feel like they do not like sanctuary cities, they feel like they are not going against their like personal thing, and also Republican leaders have a political incentive to try and act against like the New Yorks, the LA, because they're seen as unpopular within these states, can also cease trading with them to a certain extent, allowing them a capacity to have their services and goods sent around. And then there's just like thirdly, the amount of money the federal government puts into these states is a massive amount of money, and it's very difficult for these states to restructure the way in which they have their economic policies so that they can keep going. I.e., it takes a massive amount of bipartisan effort. It takes a massive amount of effort to way in which they do this. response. Secondly, opening government tell you that these states have massive amounts of protections from the Supreme Court. Note, firstly, that the Supreme Court on their current way of thinking, and note this is likely to continue for a large period of time, because this also responds to what we get out of closing government, is that the Supreme Court currently has a 6-3 majority. All of these people have life terms. Most of them, bar like 2 Republican judges who can retire in the next 2 years, are very, very young and are likely to stay in place for a very large period of time. Note that these judges have been systematically increasing the executive power that Trump has over certain things. Note other courts are bound by this, so they are very unlikely to be able to actually reduce the executive power that the states have. Note what this means is that the executive power of these states means that they can be very punitive on these states by going into them with ICE. Note that they cannot be stopped, because also note that the federal immigration is a federal issue. It does not compete with state rights. It supersedes states' rights. And also, regardless of that, even if you do say that states have their own rights to police themselves, they still do not have rights to police themselves comparatively to the federal state. They are part of a federal government. They need to abide by these laws. And no, just uniquely on the Supreme Court is likely to allow and incentivize the executive to do this, because they are prioritizing executive power, especially against states' power. Note all the various different things. They're allowing Trump to not be unilaterally stopped by injunctions as of very recent. They are overturning precedents. They are supporting massive amounts of executive power. They also tell you that these states are sympathetic. Note that this doesn't really matter if states are sympathetic, if the point at which these states do not have capacity, like I've told you, to be able to actually stop any of the immigration raids that are actually taking place within this thing. At the point at the point of which you do not have capacity to be able to support the people within your states, because they are more likely. Note, Emma tells you specifically why ICE are more likely to be really harsh on these states, because they do not have the ability to do this. This is a unique analysis, and we get to the impacts from this, i.e. even still, and even if you do say that these immigrants feel better within the states, note this is just comparatively untrue, because the most proximate thing to you is probably as an immigrant to seeing how immigration is being enforced within your state, especially as you are undocumented. And at the point of which the most proximate idea of this to you is being able to see ICE coming in and enforcing Gavin Newsom's policies. You are likely to feel very, very unsafe, because you feel it can happen to you at any stage, because it is very widespread. It is happening on a widespread thing. So you are massively uncertain. You are probably not going to do any of things. Note which this takes down a lot of their analysis on you're more likely to settle within these states. But how are you able to get this at the point of which your sanctuary state, the place in which you are living, is really, really unstable? Because not only you do not know where ICE is going to be, you do not know how they are going to do that. A couple of responses to what we get out of closing government. They tell you that in the long term, the sanctuary states are probably likely to negotiate with the federal government in order to do these things. I will note that this is probably going to take place in 3 years' time, because the current federal government has an incentive. Note that Trump doesn't actually have to be re-elected. He doesn't have that incentive, political incentive. Note he was also elected on a very hardline immigration policy. He is surrounded by people who are also very hardline in immigration. He listens to media that is very hardline on immigration. All of these things means that he's very unlikely to give concessions within the next 3 years. We think that ICE at this point are more likely to go in now, because it is very proximate to them, because Trump has the incentives to keep doing things. Secondly, just the ICE leaders have the incentive to continuously try and get the most publicity, the most amount of raids thing, because this very much appeals to the Trump base, at the point of which you want to see people being arrested. Large-scale immigration raids are going to happen at this point in time, which means that any of their benefits in the long run, I think, are completely outweighed by the short-term harms and uncertainties to these people, especially at the point of which cooperation in the future is also very, very unlikely to happen to the same extent, because one, there's probably less trust of the federal government. Two, because of all the reasons I've told you, executive power means they can probably override a lot of the states' powers when it comes to immigration, i.e. you are less likely to come to an agreement on how to treat issues within states when it comes to immigration, at the point of which you do not actually have to come to this, because the Supreme Court and the executive power allows you to do these various different things. So this takes out and mitigates a lot of their things. Even if you do accept their things, we think the wane on the actual economic uncertainty and the economic hardship for these states, at the point at which they feel they cannot they cannot have migrants who feel safe, so they're less likely to go to work, because at the point at which migrants generally, because they are undocumented, because they have all of these various different things, they generally go into jobs that are seen as they generally undocumented migrants generally go into jobs that are seen as more like construction, more likely to be farming, which are completely more cash in hand jobs. Note that a lot of these things are very easy to go to them, so migrants are probably going to be scared that ICE are going to go and take these things. Quickly, I'll take opening.
Look, all of this is just mitigation to our case. Even if
Sorry, you completely cut out there, Adrianna. Can you take it again quickly?
Look, all of this is just mitigation to our case. Even if implementation of these cities is not perfect, it still creates additional barriers for things like ICE, making their jobs harder and deportations more unlikely.
But at the point at which you make ICE jobs harder, it means they're more likely to funnel massive amounts of like money into these states. They're more likely to take really aggressive approaches because they know that they cannot rely on their old approaches that were like subversive. They have to go in massively and try and like really draw in on these things. So we think that like in terms of your like weighing and like your impacts, we actually access them in a much better way because we provide like more security for migrants at the point at which they do not feel like they have like a system that is really against them. They feel like they can have more trust. They have less trust at the point of which they do not know where they are able to go within these states. And to quickly responses to what we get out of CG on this thing, because it happens public, it's a good thing. I think just note that the Republicans generally are like because they have like campaigned on this issue of immigration, they've gone very hard line in it. They're very likely to pull back on this when they see polling numbers because one, Trump doesn't need to be re-elected, he just needs his friends to be re-elected. But also he is very like he wants to be seen as successful at the point at which like people like operate on like short-term political scales. The next election isn't for 3 years, so you're unlikely to be held back by this immigration because people are probably more like looking at things that are like more proximate to themselves, like the economy, if that is going better. Why do we win on like our bench way? We win because one, we actually access the ICE benefits in a much more analytically superior way, but we also provide like tangible impacts to the immigrants within these states, which is bad. Thank you.
I thank that speaker very much for that speech and everybody for what's been a very lovely debate. I'm just going to stop the recording.